August 17, 1943. The skies over Sicily. A formation of Lockheed P-38 Lightnings from the 1st Fighter Group, United States Army Air Forces, is intercepting a German formation at 8,000 feet, the twin-boom silhouette of the Lightning unmistakable against the Mediterranean sky. The aircraft's distinctive counter-rotating propellers visible to the German pilots, who have been briefed on exactly this aircraft, and who are making a decision right now based on that briefing. The Bf-109 pilots who see them coming make a decision that reveals everything about what the Luftwaffe has learned about this aircraft in the past 12 months. They climb. They do not stay at 8,000 feet and fight. They climb as hard as their Daimler-Benz engines will push them, trading the tactical initiative for altitude, because every German fighter pilot who has tangled with a P-38 Lightning below 10,000 feet and lived to file a report has said the same thing. Do not stay low with this aircraft. The twin-engine American fighter, with the distinctive twin-boom fuselage, the two-engine nacelles mounted on their booms, the central pilot nacelle between them, the aircraft's silhouette unlike anything else in the sky over Europe or the Mediterranean or the Pacific, that the Germans call Der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, owns the low-altitude fight in a way that the German fighter pilots of 1943 have no clean tactical answer for. And the story of why they learned that lesson, and what it cost them to learn it, and what the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots wrote into their institutional doctrine as a result, is the story of the most psychologically dominant fighter aircraft in the entire Second World War. The P-38 Lightning is not a conventional fighter aircraft. It does not look like one, it does not perform like one, and it certainly does not fight like one. Designed by Clarence Kelly Johnson at Lockheed's Burbank facility in California in response to a 1937 Army Air Corps specification for a high-altitude interceptor capable of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The P-38 is the product of the specific and genuinely innovative thinking of the engineer who will later found the Skunk Works and who approaches the interceptor requirement with the unconventional logic of the designer who is not constrained by existing configurations and who has done the mathematics and determined that the existing configurations cannot satisfy the requirement. The requirement cannot be met by a conventional single-engine fighter. Johnson determines it can be met by something else entirely. A twin-engine aircraft with two fuselage booms, one for each engine and tail assembly, connected by a central nacelle that houses the pilot and the armament whose concentrated nose placement will become the aircraft's most feared combat characteristic. The result is an aircraft whose configuration is unlike anything in mass production at the time, unlike the Bf-109, unlike the Spitfire, unlike the Zero, unlike any other fighter in any air force in the world, and whose performance envelope, when the first prototype flies in January 1939 at Muroc Dry Lake in California, confirms that the unconventional approach has produced the unconventional performance the Army Air Corps requirement demanded. The Lockheed XP-38 reaches 413 miles per hour in early testing, a speed that makes it faster than any production fighter in any air force in the world at the time. A transcontinental speed record attempt in February 1939, flying from Burbank to New York in 7 hours and 2 minutes, despite 2 mandatory refueling stops, demonstrates the aircraft's range and sustained high-speed performance in a way that the specification test flights cannot. The aircraft crashes at Mitchell Field during the landing approach, the result of carburetor icing on the final approach. But the performance data from the transcontinental flight is already in Army Air Corps hands, and the crash is beside the point. The Army Air Corps orders it immediately, recognizing that Johnson has produced not merely the high-performance interceptor the 1937 specification requested, but something more comprehensive, an airframe that offers potential for long-range escort, photographic reconnaissance, ground attack, and the multiple mission profiles that the Army Air Corps' evolving operational doctrine will find uses for that its pre-war planners did not specifically anticipate. The P-38 will fill all of these roles. It will excel at all of them. What the P-38 brings to combat that no other American fighter of the early war period can match is the specific combination of characteristics that the twin-engine configuration produces. Two Allison V11710 engines in counter-rotating configuration, one engine driving its propeller clockwise, the other counterclockwise, eliminating the torque effect and the gyroscopic precession that makes conventional single-engine fighters pull to one side during takeoff rolls and in sustained combat maneuvers, requiring the pilot to apply corrective rudder pressure and introducing a directional inconsistency that the P-38's design eliminates entirely, developing a combined 2,600 horsepower in the initial production versions and up to 3,200 horsepower in the later P-38L models, giving the Lightning a speed advantage over the Bf-109E and Bf-109F at most altitudes and a climb rate at low altitude that the Messerschmitt cannot match below 15,000 feet. A range of 1,300 miles with internal fuel, more than twice the combat radius of the Bf-109, and nearly double the range of the early P-47 Thunderbolt without drop tanks. That makes it the only American single-seat fighter capable of escorting bombers on the long-range missions that the 8th and 15th Air Forces are developing in 1942 and 1943. And the armament package: 4 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns and a single 20mm Hispano M1 cannon, all centrally mounted in the nose of the central pilot nacelle rather than in the wings, producing a convergence-free cone of fire whose lethality at any range from point-blank to 600 yards is the lethality of the aircraft, whose guns all point directly at the target regardless of the range at which the pilot opens fire. The combined firepower of the 4 50 calibers and the 20mm cannon, firing simultaneously, in a concentrated stream from a single point source rather than from multiple wing-mounted positions, delivers approximately 150 pounds of lead per minute at the target, in a package that includes the 20mm explosive round, whose effect on an aircraft structure at combat range is the effect of a small artillery shell detonating inside the fuselage or wing. The centralized armament is the P-38's most important combat characteristic, and it is the characteristic that the Luftwaffe's pilots learn to fear most specifically, learn to fear in the specific and visceral way of the combat veteran whose colleague's aircraft just came apart in front of him because the P-38 pilot opened fire from 400 yards and the convergence-free cone of fire had the same lethality at 400 yards as it does at 100 yards. Wing-mounted guns on conventional fighters require a convergence point, the specific range at which the angled gun's bullet streams intersect and achieve maximum density, and are most effective within a narrow distance band around that convergence. Inside the convergence range or outside it, the accuracy and lethality drop. The P-38's nose-mounted guns have no convergence requirement. They are effective at any range from 50 yards to 600 yards. The German pilot who thinks he has escaped by breaking inside the P-38's firing envelope, by getting so close that the wing-mounted guns of a conventional fighter would be firing past him, discovers, in the fraction of a second before the 20mm Hispano explosive round reaches his cockpit, that there is no inside the P-38's firing envelope. The guns point wherever the nose points. At 50 yards or 500 yards, the geometry is the same. The bullet goes where the nose is aimed. The nose points wherever the pilot points it. And the P-38 pilot points it with a precision that the counter-rotating propeller's elimination of torque makes more consistent than anything the Bf-109's single propeller can achieve. No left-yawing tendency in a climbing turn, no right-rolling tendency in a diving turn, the aircraft going exactly where the pilot commands it to go with the specific and exact directional fidelity that the counter-rotating configuration uniquely provides. And below 10,000 feet, where the twin Allison engines develop their maximum sea level and low-altitude power, and where the P-38's superior low-altitude speed advantage over the Bf-109 is at its greatest, the P-38 pilot can point his nose at whatever he chooses with an authority that the German fighter pilot cannot match on equal terms. The Luftwaffe's tactical problem with the P-38, as it crystallizes through the North African and Mediterranean campaigns of 1942 and 1943, and becomes the subject of the specific and documented institutional analysis that the German fighter arms after-action reporting system produces, is not that the aircraft is unbeatable, Unbeatable aircraft do not exist. The P-38 has weaknesses: the horizontal turn rate, the high-altitude engine limitations, the cockpit heating system whose inadequacy makes long missions in cold weather physically punishing for the pilot. It is that the aircraft is unbeatable on its own terms. That the conditions under which the P-38 is most dangerous are the conditions that the low-altitude fight inevitably creates, and that the Luftwaffe has no reliable tactical answer for the P-38 in those conditions that does not require giving up something essential about the German fighter's own tactical position. The answer the Luftwaffe develops, the answer that the Bf-109 pilots over Sicily are executing in August 1943 when they see the P-38s in climb, the answer written into the tactical guidance distributed to German fighter units operating in theaters where the P-38 is present, is the answer of the tactician who has identified the opponent's decisive strength and decided that the correct response is to take the fight somewhere the strength does not apply. Above 20,000 feet, the Bf-109G's two-stage supercharged Daimler-Benz DB605 engine maintains its performance more effectively than the P-38's Allison engines, whose high-altitude performance is limited by the single-stage supercharger design that Lockheed has not yet fully solved for the altitudes where the 8th Air Force needs it. Above 20,000 feet, the Bf-109G can hold its own speed advantage in level flight. Above 25,000 feet, the advantage shifts further toward the German fighter. The high-altitude fight favors the Bf-109, the low-altitude fight favors the P-38, and the German pilot who refuses to fight low is the German pilot who is still alive at the end of the mission to file his report and fly again tomorrow. The question, as the P-38 groups of the 12th and 15th Air Forces establish themselves across the Mediterranean theater in 1943, with the specific and documented operational record that is beginning to reshape the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine in real time, is whether the Luftwaffe's institutional answer of climbing away from low-altitude P-38 engagements can be sustained. As a viable response to an aircraft that operates across every altitude band, or whether the P-38's extraordinary range, its growing bomb-carrying capacity, and its demonstrated ground attack capability will force the engagements to the altitudes and the conditions where the German tactical avoidance cannot protect the targets the Luftwaffe is supposed to be defending. November 9, 1943. The skies over the Aegean Sea, between the Greek mainland and the island of Rhodes. A flight of P-38s from the 82nd Fighter Group, 15th Air Force, intercepts a formation of German transport aircraft over the deep blue water of the Aegean at 500 feet. The transports are Junkers Ju-52s, the three-engine corrugated aluminum workhorses of the Luftwaffe's transport fleet, slow and unmaneuverable at 170 miles per hour cruise speed, completely unable to defend themselves in any meaningful sense against the P-38s that have caught them at 500 feet above the Aegean, with nowhere to hide. The German fighter escort, a handful of Bf-109Gs from JG-27 operating from Rhodes, sees the P-38s approaching and makes the tactically correct German decision: they climb. They leave the transports below them and go up, because the instructors and the after-action reports and the operational memos from the Luftwaffenführungsstab in Berlin have all said the same thing about low-altitude P-38 engagements. The P-38s destroy 11 Ju-52s in the minutes that follow, the transports falling into the Aegean in the specific and violent way of the large aircraft hit at 500 feet. Trailing fire, wings separating, fuselage cartwheeling into the water in the sudden transition from flight to wreckage that the 20mm cannon produces. The German fighter escort watches from 8,000 feet. The decision to climb has saved the German fighters. It has not saved what the German fighters were supposed to protect. This is the operational trap the P-38 creates for the Luftwaffe in 1943 and 1944. The trap that no amount of individual pilot skill or unit discipline can escape, because the trap's mechanism is the specific and irresolvable contradiction between the tactical calculation and the strategic requirement. The German tactical answer to the P-38's low-altitude dominance: climb, disengage, Take the fight to altitude where the Bf-109's supercharged engine performs better, and the P-38's Allison engine limitations begin to narrow the performance gap, is a tactically coherent answer that keeps German pilots alive. But it is strategically incoherent, because the act of climbing away from the low-altitude engagement is the act of abandoning whatever is at low altitude, the transport formation that the escort has abandoned, the airfield whose Messerschmitts are being strafed on the ground, the armored column moving through the French bocage on the road that the P-38 is about to turn into a graveyard of burning vehicles, the supply depot whose rooftops are about to receive 500-pound bombs, the coastal convoy whose escort vessels are about to discover what the 20mm cannon does to a deck-level superstructure at 200 yards. The P-38 is most dangerous at low altitude, and the things the P-38 is attacking are most vulnerable at low altitude, and the German tactical response that keeps the fighters alive by climbing away from the P-38 also keeps the fighters away from the targets they are tasked to defend. The Luftwaffe has been placed in the specific and impossible position of the Air Force that cannot simultaneously protect its own pilots and protect the assets those pilots are supposed to be guarding. The fork-tailed devil has created a tactical dilemma that has no clean solution and whose costs compound with every mission. The near failure of the P-38's dominance arrives in the specific and documented form of the European theater's high-altitude operations in early 1944, where the P-38's Allison engine limitations produce the specific and costly problem that the Lockheed engineers have not yet fully resolved, and that the 8th Air Force's P-38 pilots are discovering in the worst possible classroom over occupied Europe at 25,000 feet in January. The Allison V-1710 engine, superb at low altitude and mid-altitude where its design characteristics are optimally matched to the operating conditions, is inadequately supercharged for sustained high-altitude operations in the extreme cold temperatures over northern Europe in the winter of 1943-1944. The oil in the engine's intercoolers freezes in the -55-degree temperatures at 25,000 feet over Germany, causing engine failures at the worst possible moment, over hostile territory, 400 miles from England, without fighter escort for the bombers the P-38s are supposed to be protecting. In January and February 1944, the 8th Air Force's P-38 groups, the 20th Fighter Group, the 55th Fighter Group, the 364th Fighter Group, operating over Germany on the bomber escort missions that the Big Week Offensive and the campaign against the Luftwaffe's fighter production require, report engine failure rates that compromise the escort mission's effectiveness at the altitudes and temperatures where the B-17s and B-24s need protection most. Single P-38s with engine failures over Germany become immediate targets. The Bf-109G6 and FW-190A-8 pilots at high altitude over Germany in the winter of 1944 are meeting a different P-38 than the one that their Mediterranean counterparts have been avoiding, meeting a P-38 whose Allison engine vulnerability in the extreme cold of German winter at 25,000 feet has narrowed the performance gap between the two aircraft at the altitudes where the 8th Air Force must operate. The German pilots who have been told to avoid the P-38 below 10,000 feet are discovering that above 20,000 feet over Germany in January, the P-38's disadvantage is their opportunity. The 8th Air Force's P-38 loss rates over Germany in early 1944 are significantly higher than the P-51's, and the bomber crews who are counting their escort fighters are noticing. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force from his headquarters at High Wycombe, in the specific and consequential way of the commander who has assessed the P-38's European theater performance and made the institutional decision that the assessment requires, reassigns the P-38 groups in his theater to the lower altitude ground attack and interdiction missions where the aircraft's low altitude performance is a decisive advantage and where the Allison engine's high altitude limitations are irrelevant. It is a decision that places the P-38 exactly where the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine has been most desperate to keep it away from, at low altitude, over the targets that must be defended, with the altitude advantage that the German fighters need in order to engage it having been eliminated by the ground itself. Colonel Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group and the other P-47 and P-51 groups take the high-altitude escort missions over Germany, meeting the Luftwaffe at the altitudes where the German fighters want to fight, and where the P-51's Packard Merlin engine's high-altitude performance gives the American fighter the competitive envelope it needs. The P-38 goes to the deck, goes to the low-altitude mission that its design makes it uniquely effective at, and whose execution the German tactical doctrine of climbing away from P-38 engagements has been creating the perfect conditions for since 1943. The P-38 groups of the 9th Air Force in England and the 12th Air Force in the Mediterranean begin flying the low-altitude tactical missions that will define the P-38's most consequential European contribution: railroad interdiction targeting the locomotives and bridges, and marshalling yards that the German Army's supply system depends on, airfield attack destroying aircraft on the ground and the infrastructure that keeps them flying, road transport destruction catching truck convoys on the French and Belgian highways, the systematic and methodical dismantling of the German Army's logistical coherence in France and the Low Countries and Germany in the months before and after the Normandy invasion. The legacy of the P-38 Lightning in the Second World War is the legacy that the specific and documented tactical response of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots to the aircraft's low-altitude dominance defines most precisely, defines in the specific and institutional way of the military doctrine that is written down in response to an aircraft, which is the highest form of acknowledgement a weapon system receives. 33 American aces flew the P-38 to their ace status, 5 or more confirmed aerial victories in the European and Mediterranean theaters, making it among the most ace-producing American aircraft of the war. Richard Bong, the highest-scoring American ace of the entire war, with 40 confirmed aerial victories, flew the P-38 in the Pacific over New Guinea and the Philippines. Thomas Maguire, the second-highest American ace of the entire war, with 38 victories, flew the P-38 in the Pacific. Charles MacDonald, with 27 victories, flew the P-38 with the 475th Fighter Group. Robin Olds, who would become one of the most celebrated American fighter pilots in history, 12 victories in World War II, later 4 more in Vietnam, flew the P-38 with the 479th Fighter Group in England. David Kingsley, Gerald Johnson, Jay Robbins, all P-38 pilots, all aces. The aircraft that the German pilots called the Fork-tailed Devil and avoided at low altitude produced the highest-scoring American aces in multiple theaters simultaneously. In the Pacific, where the long-range requirements of island-hopping warfare made the P-38 the only viable single-seat fighter for much of 1943 and 1944, and in the Mediterranean, where the P-38 groups accumulated the aerial victory records that established the institutional Luftwaffe doctrine of avoidance that this story began with. This is not a coincidence of the aircraft's assignment to particular theaters or particular pilots. It is a consequence of the design's capabilities, of the centralized armament and the twin-engine speed, and the counter-rotating propeller's precision in the targeting solution, and the range that kept the P-38 in combat long after its opponents were breaking off for fuel. The P-38's 10,000-foot boundary, the altitude below which the German tactical doctrine strongly counseled against engagement without overwhelming numerical advantage or a significant altitude advantage that the German pilot could convert into the diving attack that initiated the engagement on terms favorable to the Bf-109, was not a fixed feature of the aircraft's capability, but a consequence of the specific tactical calculation that the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots had made about where the P-38's advantages were greatest, and where the risk of engaging it was least survivable for the German fighter pilot. Below 10,000 feet, the twin Allison V-1710 engines at maximum continuous power gave the P-38 a speed advantage over the Bf-109G6 of approximately 30 miles per hour in level flight at sea level, growing to approximately 40 miles per hour at 5,000 feet, where the Allison's low-altitude power output peaked, and a significantly greater advantage in the diving attack whose geometry the P-38's twin-engine weight of 15,000 pounds at gross weight made devastating. When a 15,000-pound twin-engine fighter with the aerodynamics of the Lightning's twin-boom configuration puts its nose down in a power-on dive, the speed it generates in the dive exceeds what most single-engine fighters of the period can match in the same dive angle. The P-38's mass and its relatively clean aerodynamics combine to build velocity in the dive with the specific and impressive acceleration of the heavy aircraft whose weight works in its favor when gravity is doing the accelerating. And the energy it retains at the bottom of the dive gives it the specific and decisive advantage in the zoom climb that follows. The ability to pull up from the diving attack and convert the dive's accumulated energy into altitude gain, regaining the height that the engagement has consumed faster than the BF-109 or FW-190 can follow, arriving at the top of the zoom with enough airspeed to reverse and begin the second diving attack. The German pilot who tries to follow a P-38 through the zoom climb after a diving attack finds himself in the specific and lethal position of the aircraft that is slower in the climb, whose energy is depleting faster than the P-38's, and whose pilot knows with the specific and professional certainty of the combat veteran that the P-38 above him is about to reverse and come back down with the speed advantage that the zoom climb has rebuilt, and that there is nothing he can do to prevent the second diving attack except maneuver out of its path. The correct defensive response is to brake hard horizontally, to turn, which bleeds speed from both aircraft, but more from the P-38, whose twin-engine weight and wider wingspan make it less maneuverable in the horizontal turn than the single-engine BF-109 or FW-190. The P-38's one genuine tactical weakness at low altitude is the horizontal turn rate. At the same speed, in a sustained horizontal turn, the P-38 turns less tightly than the BF-109 and less tightly than the FW-190, the weight penalty of the twin engines, which add mass without adding the structural lightness that the single-engine fighter achieves, and the longer wingspan of 52 feet that the twin-boom configuration requires, both working against the aircraft's turning performance in the specific and measurable way of the fighter pilot's calculation of the turning radius and the turn rate that determines who gets on whose tail in the sustained turning fight. The BF-109G's wing loading is significantly lower than the P-38's, giving it the tighter instantaneous turn at the beginning of the turning fight and the sustained turn rate advantage that compounds over multiple turns. The German pilot who can force the P-38 into a horizontal turning fight at low altitude has found the one competitive situation where the BF-109's lighter weight and superior turn radius give him a genuine advantage. The problem is getting there. Getting the P-38 into a horizontal turning fight requires catching it, or making it commit to a turn, and the P-38's superior speed means the P-38 pilot chooses whether the fight becomes a turning fight or stays a speed and energy fight. The P-38 pilot who understands his aircraft does not choose the turning fight. He uses his speed advantage to disengage from the turn before the BF-109's superior turn rate becomes decisive, extends away, and comes back with the energy advantage that the extension has rebuilt. He chooses the speed and energy fight because it is the fight his aircraft was designed for and the fight the German pilot was briefed to avoid. And in the speed and energy fight at low altitude, where the twin Allison engines are producing their maximum output and the P-38's speed advantage is at its largest, the P-38 wins. The 12th Air Force's P-38 groups over North Africa and the Mediterranean between November 1942 and September 1943 destroyed over 1,200 German and Italian aircraft in air-to-air combat and on the ground, while flying the escort and ground attack missions that ranged from the Egyptian border to Tunisia, to Sicily, to the Italian mainland. While the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine of avoiding low-altitude engagement with the P-38 steadily evolved from the informal practice of the individual pilots who had discovered the aircraft's capabilities the hard way, in the specific and personal way of the pilot who survives an engagement with a P-38 below 5,000 feet and tells his squadron mates exactly what it felt like. into the formal institutional doctrine that the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader units posted on their briefing room walls and communicated through the Jagd leadership's operational guidance. Do not engage the P-38 below 10,000 feet without altitude advantage and numerical superiority. Both conditions simultaneously, not one or the other. The 1st Fighter Group, the 14th Fighter Group, and the 82nd Fighter Group, the 3 original P-38 groups deployed to the Mediterranean, accumulated the aerial victory records that produced this institutional acknowledgement of the aircraft's low-altitude dominance. Major Robin Olds, flying with the 479th Fighter Group in England and accumulating the aerial victories that would establish him as one of the war's most accomplished fighter pilots, would later describe the P-38's combat personality in the terms that every experienced pilot who flew it in combat eventually arrived at. It was not an aircraft that rewarded the pilot who tried to fight the way everyone else fought, who used the tactics that the Bf-109 pilots were trained to counter, and the tactical doctrines that the gunnery school had taught for the turn-and-burn single-engine fighters, whose maneuverability was their primary advantage. It rewarded the pilot who understood what the aircraft could do that nothing else could: the speed, the centralized armament, the counter-rotating propeller's elimination of torque in the turning fight, the range, the zoom climb's energy retention, and who exploited that understanding in the air with the specific and ruthless application of the aircraft's strengths at every opportunity, mercilessly. What the German aces who refused to dogfight the P-38 Lightning below 10,000 feet understood in the specific and hard-won way of the combat veteran whose understanding is built not from the training manual, but from the wreckage of the colleagues who learned it wrong, and from the specific and personal experiences of the engagement survived by a margin so thin that the lesson of what to do differently next time was burned into the professional memory, was that the P-38 had redrawn the boundary of what low-altitude air combat meant. Every aircraft has an altitude band where it performs best, and the pilot who can force the fight into his aircraft's optimal altitude band has the decisive advantage in the specific and professional sense of the advantage that determines who gets the firing solution first. The P-38's optimal performance band at low altitude was broader, more decisive in its performance margin over the available German opponents, and harder to escape from than anything the Luftwaffe had encountered from a single-seat American fighter in any theater of the war to that point. The specific and documented tactical acknowledgement of this reality, the Luftwaffe's institutional doctrine of climbing away from P-38 engagements below 10,000 feet, posted on briefing room walls and circulated through the Jagd unit commander network, is the highest tribute an enemy air force can pay to a fighter aircraft. Not praise in a communique, not acknowledgement in a captured memo, but avoidance built into the doctrine that determines how your best pilots behave in combat. The twin engines that made it unconventional also made it relentless, gave it the power reserve to sustain the attack through the entire engagement without the engine strain that a single-engine fighter accumulates at maximum combat power, the speed to choose the engagement's geometry and disengage when the geometry stopped being favorable, and the firepower to end the engagement quickly when the geometry was right. The German pilot who climbed away from the P-38 at low altitude was not a coward. He was a professional making the correct tactical calculation with the specific information available to him. The after-action reports filed by the pilots who had survived low-altitude P-38 engagements, the briefing room guidance posted by the Jagdgeschwader commanders, the professional knowledge of what the P-38's 20mm cannon does to an aircraft at 200 yards. The fork-tailed devil was not to be fought on its own ground, not below 10,000 feet, not at low altitude, not in the speed and energy fight, where the twin engines made the outcome a foregone conclusion. And in the years between 1942 and 1945, wherever the P-38 groups operated, over the Western Desert, over Tunisia, over Sicily, over the Italian mainland, over France, over the Pacific Island chains, over Germany, when the escort mission required it. Its own ground was wherever the altimeter read below 10,000 feet. That was the number, 10,000 feet. The number that the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots wrote into their operational doctrine, posted on their briefing room walls in the specific and institutional form of the guidance that keeps fighter pilots alive, and carried in their professional memory as the altitude below which the fork-tailed devil owned the sky, and the German pilot who stayed to fight it was the German pilot who did not come home.